If we can regulate cannabis, then why not cocaine? Given the rising levels of cocaine use in the Nordics and Europe, what can we do to try and reduce the harm? The next two speakers will take up this discussion more so than debate, with input from the audience via Slido, so please log in and put your questions there. When both sides have had their say, you'll have the opportunity to vote whether you think cocaine should be legalized. So arguing on behalf of cocaine regulation, we have Steve Rollis from the UK, writer and policy analyst at Transform Drug Policy Foundation. Steve was lead author on many of Transform's publications and is a regular contributor to the public debate on drug policy. Standing in the opposite corner, we have Dagfinn Paust, founding member and chief scientific officer at the Norwegian Association for Safer Drug Policy, who we met earlier today, correct. Please welcome Steve and Dagfinn. Okay, so to get us started, Steve, maybe you can tell us a little bit about what are the harms of the illicit cocaine economy?
Well, I mean, the war on drugs, the war on cocaine has been going for 50, 60, depends where you want to start, but generations. During that time, cocaine use has increased. Cocaine is more available. It's cheaper. It's purer. More people are using it, more people are having problems with it, more people are dying or seeking emergency services related to cocaine. So on any metric, it's clearly been a complete failure as a policy approach. But it's not just that it's failed on its own terms, it's also empowered and enabled a global market worth something in the region of $150 billion a year. All the profits from that market go to organized crime groups and are destabilizing entire countries and regions across the world, from West Africa through Central America and obviously Latin America and the Andean region, where most of the coca leaf that produces cocaine is grown. It's fueling violence, instability, undermining institutions, fueling insecurity, and death and violence. It's an almost unimaginable disaster as a policy paradigm. In Mexico, there's around 100,000 drug war-related murders every year. So more than 10,000 deaths related to drug war violence every month. So it puts the kind of health implications of cocaine use in Nordic countries or European countries in perspective when you see the carnage that the illegal market is causing. And we'll hear from Neil Woods later this afternoon about some of the knock-on effects on the environment from this trade. So it has been a complete disaster, and that has to be the starting point for any discussion about where we go from here.
Great, thank you, Steve. Dagfinn, why do you have reservations about cocaine regulation?
So, Steve and I are not in... One second. Is that better? Yeah. So Steve and I are not in much of a disagreement here.
He helped with my book.
It's enough.
He's a co-author.
It's enough.
It's going to be the worst debate ever.
But this could be interesting. But so first of all, I would like to say that I share this description of the situation, this understanding of it, and I think that any cocaine policy that does not have as one of its primary goals to minimize and preferably eradicate at least this form of illicit economy that we're seeing, and really just bring the illicit cocaine trade down to a minimum, is going to be the wrong policy. We need to do that. So to the extent that I have reservations, you know, I don't know if this is even what Steve is suggesting, but if someone suggested that we just need to legalize powder cocaine here and now, sell it like alcohol in order to solve the problem of the illicit cocaine trade. I would have reservations against that. So my view is that we have a lot of different tools at our disposition, in theory at least, when it comes to dealing with this market. And I believe that any strategy for minimizing an illicit market for a drug has to address demand. Otherwise, there's no point. Supply side measures alone have just been completely failed throughout history. So the question is, how do we acknowledge this demand? How do we meet it in some way that could be more favorable than just selling powder cocaine like alcohol tomorrow? That's how I try to approach this. And I think that there are some things we could consider. We could consider some form of substitution. And I mean that in the broadest sense of the word. I mean, when we introduced methadone, heroin markets shrank considerably. When we introduced snus, cigarette use went down. So similarly, there may be other drugs, less harmful preferably, that could have a similar appeal. So we should investigate whether that could be worthwhile to make some of those available before we make conventional cocaine available or as available. I also think that we should look at the situations in which cocaine is being used. So undeniably, cocaine is an adjunct to alcohol, mostly. I mean, there are exceptions in the crack cocaine culture. There are different practices, you could say, but in our part of the world, it's largely an adjunct to alcohol. So then the question is, are there things we could do about alcohol consumption or alcohol regulation, alcohol culture, that could modify the need for cocaine as an adjunct to alcohol? And of course, those who have problematic use, are there options such as stimulant substitution treatment that could reduce their demand for cocaine? Now, I'm not saying that any of these solutions are necessarily easy or even feasible, but I'm saying that those are the types of things we should be looking at before we go with the nuclear option. But with that in mind, I'd like to repeat that if we don't address the illicit cocaine market, then we've failed.
I mean, what would you see as being the direct consequences of failing to address that?
Well, we're seeing those consequences already. Even if those consequences aren't affecting us here in Norway very directly, that's an incredibly, that's an incredibly unsolidaric position. I mean, we're basically, we're letting people die in order to save some money on our public health budgets, right? That's not an easy thing to defend. So I would not defend it if I didn't think that there were some intermediary tools to be used. And perhaps even in the end, we will realize that we do need to have some kind of legal cocaine supply in addition to these other tools that could then mitigate the consumption. But these are all empirical questions.
Thank you. You mentioned sort of cocaine powder and crack. As far as I understand, the law treats everything as just one type of thing, cocaine. Are there any other forms of cocaine that can maybe be useful in this process?
Yeah, I mean, cocaine is it's a fascinating drug because you have everything from coca leaf, which has been traditionally consumed as a chewed coca leaf or coca tea, or various other sort of mildly processed preparations of the coca leaf for thousands of years in Andean cultures without any harms at all. It's really not associated with any health risks any more than like coffee or tea. And brings some benefits. People use it to deal with altitude sickness. They use it it has some nutritional benefits. It's not associated with any harms at all. If you concentrate it, take the cocaine alkaloid out into a powder, it then becomes more risky. And if you then make it into a smokable preparation, i.e. crack, or injectable preparation of cocaine, it then becomes very risky. So you have this spectrum of preparations of the same drug that are associated with hugely different behaviors hugely different motivations for use, and significantly different levels of risk, even though it's the same drug, and the law makes no distinction. We have to be sophisticated enough and intelligent enough to have different policy responses to those different things. But you don't deal with them the same. Crack and coca leaf are not the same, even though they are technically the same drug. The problem with prohibition and the war on drugs is it's tilted the market towards powder cocaine and crack. So it's easy to get powder cocaine and crack in Oslo, I'm sure. If you can make a few calls, get some. Certainly in London, where I'm from, very easy to get cocaine and crack. There's WhatsApp dealers. But it's impossible to get coca leaf. You can't buy coca tea, you can't buy mambe, you can't buy the lower potency cocaine products, which are much safer. It's like going into a pub and only being able to get vodka shots. You can't buy light beer. And it's crazy. And one of the things that we would like to do with a regulated approach is tilt the market the other way. Use our regulation and our state interventions in the market to tilt the market in favor of the safer products and encourage people to move that direction rather than to move towards the most dangerous and high-risk products. Now, I absolutely agree with everything Dagfinn said, and I'm sorry we're not going to disagree very much. But this, it's not calling for regulation of cocaine is not a pro-cocaine position. It's a pragmatic position about dealing with reality. And the reality is 30 or 40 million people around the world use cocaine every year. It's a market worth 180 billion, as I've said. It's not going away. It's probably only growing. We either regulate it somehow or we leave it as it is. And to my mind, that is the nuclear option. Prohibition is the nuclear option because it's clearly a disaster. We either regulate it somehow or we leave how it is. There's no third option where cocaine magically disappears. It's here, whether you like it or not. And I don't like it. People on cocaine are quite boring. They can be obnoxious and talk about themselves. It doesn't matter whether you like it or not. We have to deal with it. As responsible policymakers, we have to deal with the world as we find it. And the world as we find it is full of fucking cocaine. That's where again, that's the starting point, is dealing with reality. And we have to be pragmatic. And to some extent, it may be a least worst option. If we can't get rid of it, we have to manage it to reduce the harm it causes. And of course, as Dagfinn, I think, very importantly pointed out, the cocaine market doesn't exist independently of other markets. And cocaine-using behaviors do not exist independently of other drug-using behaviors. Polydrug use is very much the norm with cocaine use. Alcohol, most obviously, but also cannabis and ketamine and MDMA and a whole bunch of other drugs are used together. And psychedelics to some extent. And we need to have the sophistication to manage our response to all of these drugs to, again, encourage people to make sensible decisions and move them in the direction of reduced risk and harm. And that applies both to public health use, but also to the markets. And the worst possible option with the market is obviously violent criminal organizations destroying entire countries to supply most of the cocaine produced in Colombia and Peru and Bolivia is to supply markets in North America and Europe. So it's, to meet our greedy need for cocaine, we are wreaking carnage across the world. And I just think it's really, really important to remember it's not just a domestic issue. This is an international development issue. It's an environmental issue. It's an issue of security and peace. And development. And we can't deliver the sustainable development goals that we're all signed up to, the 2030 sustainable development goals. We can't deliver those goals in these key producer and transit regions while a war on drugs we are fighting a war on. You can't be fighting a war and expect to have sustainable development. It simply doesn't work.
So it seems like the cost to the developing countries, to the countries where the product is coming from, is very clear. If we put that to one side for a moment, what is the direct health cost? You mentioned that mambe, this coca leaf, doesn't have any health impact, but powdered cocaine, crack cocaine, what is the impact on the body?
Doug, I don't know if you want to say anything on this. I mean, cocaine, it's not good for you. It's probably the most obvious risk is to do with cardiac health. There is a suggestion that people who use cocaine regularly are at much greater risk from cardiac-related illness and cardiac arrests and higher mortality rates from cardiac-related problems. It can cause quite serious dependence and the related problems that come with that. And it is often associated with codependent alcohol problems. So there are a range of health problems associated with cocaine. But it is also important to say that for most people who use cocaine occasionally and moderately, they would have a few lines of cocaine at a party, on their birthday, at New Year or whatever. It's not associated with significant health harms. But as with any drugs, there is a minority of people who are using at a higher intensity and frequency who will have real problems, particularly with smoked cocaine or injected cocaine. And again, particularly when it's used in conjunction with other drugs. Is that a reasonable summary?
I think that's very reasonable, and I'd just like to add that there's some reason to believe that cocaine is more harmful than some other similar stimulants. It has certain particular effects on the heart due to its local anesthetic function, which will exacerbate the risks of coronary disease, and in general also it's very potently vasoconstrictive. It constricts the blood vessels in all the end organs in your body, so the danger of some kind of infarction or blood clot in many different organs, including the brain, is real. But I agree, to most users it's not going to be particularly dangerous. What's difficult about this discussion is that we actually don't have that good data on the harms of cocaine. Like, there's a lot to suggest that cocaine is pretty bad for you, but it's very difficult to quantify exactly how bad, because there are so many confounders in this epidemiological research. We don't know what defines cocaine users as a group. They have ostensibly much higher mortality rates than other people of the same age, and that are comparable in many ways, but probably not in all ways. So there's a precautionary element here. We could say that since we just know that it's unhealthy and we don't know how unhealthy, we should be careful in unleashing it on a population where it's not very widespread yet. But there is no reason why cocaine should be addressed in the same way by all nations. And in fact, Norway has been seeing headlines recently about cocaine use being rampant, but it's still a very marginal phenomenon here. I would say that a country that has much higher levels of use would be much more suited to addressing this problem through a regulated legal supply, because they're contributing so much more to the market. But that being said, I completely agree that the mild products like coca leaf, coca tea, there is no reason to consider those the same drug. And there's no reason why every country in the world should not be selling coca tea. Give the growers something else to grow to start with, and that should not be controversial at all.
But we don't know. I mean, were we to open up the market to coca leaf and coca tea and mambe and some of these other oral coca products, you can get like coca leaf snus with sort of like ground up coca leaf with a what is it that releases the alkaloid? The
bicarbonate.
Yeah, something like that releases the alkaloid as an oral product. There's no reason why those things shouldn't be available, because they're not associated with significant health issues of any kind. But we don't know to what extent that would eat into the powder cocaine market.
No, we don't.
I mean, but powder cocaine has its own culture, and it has its own cachet, and it has its own status, and so on. And would people who would normally be snorting cocaine at cocktail parties be wanting to chew coca leaf? I don't know. Probably not. But maybe. I mean, who knows? Or maybe we could have like a cocaine, like Red Bull type drink, or like Coca-Cola, which originally did it, of course, famously had cocaine in it once upon a time. Maybe we could have some sort of cocaine stimulant beverages, which would like coca tea, but marketed to a Western market. So there are interesting options there, but they also have risks. Yeah. If we had a cocaine drink, people would do cocaine, Red Bull, and vodka, and it's like, no, that's not what we want. We don't want to be mixing alcohol and cocaine. So you kind of go, oh, this is a good idea. Oh, is it? I'm not sure. So these are the kind of regulatory dilemmas and balancing acts, the kind of thing that Dag was talking about in your presentation this morning.
Because there are many different stimulants with different characteristics and risks, of course. But it would be interesting to see if other stimulants could have some of the same appeal as cocaine, but be less conducive to concomitant alcohol use, for instance. If people are using, say, methadone or cathinone or MDMA or some MDMA-like stimulant, what are the chances that they will still be drinking a lot?
Or low-dose psychedelics
Yes.
in recreational settings, 2CB or small doses of psilocybin, which are a kind of psychostimulant.
Yeah, low-dose LSD.
They maybe play quite well in social settings. So again, I think the interaction of different drug markets and drug behaviors is something we need to look at. And you can't just look, do we legalize cocaine or not? Well, it depends what else is available, because people do substitute between stimulants and between different wider drug groups in terms of their drug choices in social settings, which we're mostly talking about here. But then also when you're looking at problematic crack and injected cocaine use, which is, again, where most of the public health harms take place with regards to cocaine, and also, again, coming back to the Pareto principle that Dag was talking about this morning, most of the cocaine market is actually crack. But by proportionally, cocaine powder is actually not, most of it is crack use, because you have this small number of people using loads of cocaine. So most of it is actually crack at smoked and injected cocaine is where the majority of the market is. If you look at the US, the prevalence of cocaine use at a population level has gone way down over the last 30 years. But the actual amount of cocaine being consumed has gone up massively because the market's shifted from powder cocaine to problematic crack use.
If one were to find a particularly effective treatment for cocaine addiction, which for which there is none, of which there are none today, that would probably alone make a huge impact into this market.
Sure, there's no methadone sort of equivalent.
There's no effective treatment,
they've
particularly
tried
effective.
They've tried some stuff. They've tried dexamphetamine, they've tried modafinil, they've tried Ritalin, they've tried giving people coca leaf, and even giving people cannabis. Some of those things work a bit for some people, but there's no... Cocaine dependence is a very different beast to opioid dependence in terms of available treatment responses.
Let's say there was the political will to legalize and regulate tomorrow. How do we go about doing that, and what are the risks?
Well, I've written this book, which is available online. I'm not trying to sell it, by the way. If anyone's interested, you can download it as a PDF. I mean, we've come up with some proposals to begin a discussion. So I co-authored that book, by the way. It's not just me. I wrote it with Harvey Slade and James Nichols from Transform, just to be clear. To begin a discussion, because I fully understand that people find the idea of cocaine, legal cocaine, because they associate cocaine with so many bad things, whether it's ill health or gangsterism or cartels or whatever. The idea of legalizing cocaine is people have a gut reaction against it. Many do in the public debate, maybe not so much here, but we have to begin a discussion. What would it look like? And we've proposed a 3-tiered model where you have effectively an open market for coca leaf, similar to, you market that like coffee or Red Bull. Basically, it would just be like a regulated supermarket product with health warnings and stuff on it. We'd have a very strict sort of pharmacy sales model for cocaine powder that would be an effective state monopoly. You would have rationed amounts. It would probably be a kind of membership cards basis, so you could only buy a certain amount per week or per month. It would be a pharmaceutical product with warnings, and we've done these like mocked up packaging, what that would look like, but basically like a pharmaceutical product. And then for crack and injected cocaine, you wouldn't have a retail model, you would have a harm reduction response. You would provide safe spaces for use, you'd provide safer inhalation kits, you'd provide access to services, the kind of things that we already do for crack users and people who inject opioids. So it's a 3-tiered model. The idea being, like I've already said, that you would try and shift use towards the safer products. You would restrict cocaine powder you would make it available, but in a suitably restricted sort of rationed pharmacy sales type model. And then you would have a health and harm reduction approach to crack cocaine. We thought that was a pragmatic starting point, but as I say, we have to be mindful that that would interact with all sorts of other drug markets. And me and Dag have been having a lot of discussions recently about how you would deal with the cocaine and alcohol problem in particular. You know, would you allow cocaine in sale or use in recreational settings? Because all recreational settings essentially have alcohol available. But we've also talked about could you have like dry nightclubs where you could use other drugs but not have alcohol?
You could do that without regulation. You could just have this sanctuary place where people are allowed to, have raves and do whatever drug they want except alcohol, and see how much cocaine use would there be there.
Jail them.
I assume virtually none.
So if anyone has some free time to organize something.
But it's that kind of thinking, pragmatically thinking about how your regulation will interact with behaviors, but because regulation can change behavioral norms over time, but it doesn't happen fast. You couldn't just, legalize something, put something on the package, and expect everyone to change their behaviors. You have to carefully evaluate and take incremental steps. So when Dag was saying, I don't want to legalize cocaine and have it available in shops next to alcohol, obviously that's not what we're proposing. And that was a sort of rhetorical point. That's not what we're proposing. You would move slowly. So perhaps first you would open up a coca leaf, maybe oral coca products type market to start with. See how that progressed. Maybe have a pilot project for cocaine powder, and have harm reduction services better attuned to crack and injected cocaine use as well. In fact, that is basically what was proposed in a bill that was tabled in the Colombian Senate 2 years ago. So just to be clear, this debate is not just purely theoretical, happening in transform books and conversations at drug policy conferences. It is happening in the real world. So this bill was tabled in the Colombian Senate. It never progressed because there was an election called. But one of the senators who was working on that bill was Gustavo Petro, who won the election and is now president of Colombia, and has spoke in favor of the bill for they included a legal cocaine market. So the president of Colombia is now advocating for cocaine regulation. So this is a real debate happening in the real world at a high level. He tweeted Joe Biden a piece in The Economist saying it's time to legalize cocaine. You've got the president of Colombia tweeting the president of the US about cocaine regulation. This is a real debate now. There's a big conference in Amsterdam in January about stimulant regulation with a bunch of mayors from all European cities. And the mayor of Bogota is coming over for it. There's a project underway, or being proposed at least, in Switzerland to look at, in Basel, I think, at municipal level, to look at possible regulation of cocaine. So it is beginning to happen, and these things do happen and can move quite fast. If you think about it, it was only 10 years ago, nowhere in the world had legalized cannabis. Nowhere. And then Colorado and Washington and Uruguay and Canada, and then 22 US states, and Mexico and South Africa and Thailand, and 5 countries in Europe now, and Malta. And, 500 million people now live in legal cannabis jurisdictions. Nobody lived in a legal cannabis jurisdiction in the beginning of 2012. So things can move quite fast, and change begins with these kinds of conversations and these kinds of debates. But it is happening now, and I think it's important for all of us to be having these discussions. How do we do it? How do we get it right? Is where the discussion needs to be.
I'd just like to add that I agree with that type of regulatory framework, if cocaine were to be legally supplied. But I think one concern that a lot of the protesting voices would have is, as always, think of the children, right? So the danger of cocaine, or powder cocaine, or the potent type being diverted to underage users. So suspect that if this were to be done in our political setting at some point in time, a pilot with concentrated cocaine would probably have to be some kind of on-premise model. So like there would be some nightlife where only adults or people above a certain age could go, and there they could get cocaine, but they couldn't take the cocaine or any significant amount with them home. Because that would be virtually impervious to any kind of diversion concerns. And probably, I always think in terms of not just what policy would be like good for public health or less risky, but I also think in terms of what kind of policy is the most immune to some kind of moral panic reversing the whole thing. Because all you need is like 1 or 2 high-profile cases of some kids getting a hold of cocaine or someone taking mushrooms and jumping out a window, whatever, to have policy consequences. So if you make it watertight in that respect, at least in a pilot, I think that would make the whole thing more realistic and probably, well, definitely safer as well.
I mean, I think another thing that's worth considering is that we could see a kind of market shock at some point. For example, if someone figures out a way to synthesize cocaine independently from the plant, like they did with MDMA about 10 years ago, you could suddenly, if people are trying to make cocaine using yeast in big vats, if they figure out how to do that, the entire global market will transform overnight. Yeah. Cocaine will become very, very available and very cheap. It can be produced by the same organized crime groups who are making MDMA in the Netherlands, for example, or anywhere, and everything changes. And we need to be, what happens then? Yeah. Does that accelerate the need for regulation, or does it? What does it mean? Or what if someone comes along with a super cocaine, a bit like kind of fentanyl to the heroin market? What about if someone comes along with cocaine that instead of working for 20 minutes works for 3 hours, or 10 hours, or 20 hours? What if some of these other cathinones, synthetic drugs, and there's a wave of these new synthetic substances emerging. Maybe some of them will displace cocaine. They will find a consumer preference. Maybe some of them will be more risky, so maybe some of them will be safer. We don't really know where this is going to go, and especially when it's all taking place in an unregulated space, that makes policy design and responses especially difficult.
I mean, in the same way that the futurists are worrying about the risks of CRISPR and quantum computers and protein folding and all these things making some very, very complicated chemistry all of a sudden just a piece of cake to anybody with a basement spare time. We should assume that the drug reality is going to change at some point in the future, and things will become ubiquitous and impossible to stop. That doesn't mean we have to make them ubiquitous right now to get a head start, but it means we need to think about these possibilities, and we need to think about regulation that could address also that kind of future.
You've discussed the potential consequences of new alternatives on the market and also the impact of regulation here in the West. But what happens to the rest of that supply chain? What happens to the farmers? What happens with the cartels if all of this changes? Have you got any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, from a cartel perspective, you could say, well, this is good because you're reducing one of their major sources of income, you're disempowering them. Hopefully, a lot of the bad things that they do in terms of undermining institutions and environmental damage, you're going to hear more about that later from Neil. A lot of those things could get reduced if we either regulated cocaine or if the cocaine market moved to a synthetic version. Although that would potentially open up other new organized crime activity. But the problem is, of course, that there are there's several million people, perhaps 2 million people who work in the illegal cocaine economy who are not rich cartel bosses. They're not Pablo Escobars. These are mostly displaced people, people socially and economically marginalized people, living at the margins. It's a survival economy for them. They grow coca because they have few other alternatives. or they smuggle coca because they don't have any other options. And I think this is a development issue. This is an economic. It's a moral imperative that as we move towards a legally regulated market, we don't abandon these people who are already been, oppressed and abandoned in so many other ways. We need to be thinking about them and how we can make sure that they have alternative, sustainable livelihoods, whether that's in a legal coca economy in the future or whether it's some kind of other alternative sustainable growth. But absolutely, we can't just abandon those people because they're already victims of the war on drugs. We don't want to make them victims of the reform and legalization as well.
Thank you very much, Paul and Dagfinn. Yeah,
Steve.
Steve, sorry. Thanks, Steve.
Cheers.